The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Officer Marcus Reid first noticed his partner acting strange. Rex, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt oak and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 solved cases, stood frozen at the entrance of the abandoned Holloway house on the corner of Maple and Ninth. His ears were pinned forward, muscles coiled beneath his fur like compressed springs, and a low, guttural sound escaped his throat that Marcus had never heard before in their 5 years together. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't a growl. It was something primal, something ancient, as if the dog was speaking a language that predated human civilization itself. Marcus tugged on the leash, but Rex wouldn't move. His paws were planted on the cracked pavement as if they had grown roots, and his entire body trembled with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of Marcus's neck stand at attention. "Come on, boy," Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man who had seen the worst humanity had to offer. "It's just an old house. We've got the patrol route to finish." But Rex didn't budge. If anything, his focus intensified, his nostrils flaring as he drew in deep, deliberate breaths of the rain-soaked air. The abandoned house loomed before them, its windows like dead eyes staring out at the world, its paint peeling away in strips that hung like shed skin. The Holloway house had been empty for 17 years, ever since old Mrs. Holloway had passed away in her sleep, and her estranged children had fought so bitterly over the inheritance that the property had been left to rot in legal limbo. Kids told stories about it. Teenagers dared each other to touch the front door. But no one, not in all those years, had ever gone inside. No one except whoever, or whatever, had caught Rex's attention tonight. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the next 45 minutes would change his life forever. They would change everything he believed about instinct, about loyalty, and about the invisible threads that connect all living beings. What they would find in the basement of that house would make the entire department cry, would make the evening news anchors pause mid-sentence to collect themselves, and would remind an entire city what it truly means to be a hero. But for now, in this moment, Marcus Reid simply stood in the rain, confused and slightly annoyed that his usually obedient partner was refusing to continue their routine patrol. Let's go back to where this story really began. 12 hours earlier, when the sun was still struggling to break through the gray November clouds, Marcus Reid woke up in his small apartment on the east side of Cedar Falls at exactly 5:30 in the morning, just as he had done every single day for the past 11 years. His alarm clock hadn't gone off yet, but his internal rhythm was as reliable as a Swiss watch, honed by years of discipline and routine. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, where a water stain had been slowly expanding for the past 3 months, a stain he kept meaning to report to his landlord, but somehow never did. The apartment was quiet, except for the sound of Rex's breathing from his bed in the corner, a rhythmic whoosh of air that Marcus found more comforting than any white noise machine could provide. Rex was getting older. Marcus thought about this more often now than he used to. 7 years old meant that the German shepherd was entering his twilight years of active service, and the department had already started making noises about retirement timelines and replacement protocols. The thought of partnering with a different dog, or worse, working without a canine partner at all, created a hollow feeling in Marcus's chest that he preferred not to examine too closely. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and placed his feet on the cold hardwood floor, letting the shock of it chase away the last remnants of sleep. Across the room, Rex lifted his head, ears perked, and their eyes met in that silent communication that had developed between them over 5 years of working together, of eating together, of existing as two halves of a single operational unit. "Morning, boy," Marcus said, and Rex's tail thumped once against his bed in response. They went through their morning routine with the precision of a military drill. Marcus showered while Rex ate his breakfast, measured exactly according to the veterinarian's specifications for a working dog of his size and activity level. Then Marcus ate his own breakfast, 3 eggs scrambled with cheese, 2 pieces of whole wheat toast and black coffee, while Rex sat at his feet, watching each bite travel from plate to mouth with patient, unblinking attention. At 6:15, they left the apartment. At 6:22, they arrived at the Cedar Falls Police Department's K-9 unit facility. At 6:30, they reported for duty. The day had been unremarkable up until that point. A routine patrol through the downtown area in the morning, a drug detection sweep at the high school during lunch, which came up clean and left the principal looking both relieved and vaguely disappointed. An afternoon spent doing community outreach at the elementary school, where Rex had patiently endured the enthusiastic attention of 40 third-graders who all wanted to pet his ears and ask if he could really smell bad guys. Marcus had answered questions about what it was like to be a police officer, his words following the familiar script he had developed over years of similar presentations. Yes, it could be dangerous. No, he didn't carry the same kind of gun they saw in movies. Yes, Rex was his best friend. No, you couldn't keep a police dog as a regular pet. They needed special training and handling. By 3 o'clock, when they returned to the station to file their daily reports, Marcus felt the comfortable fatigue of a day well spent settling into his bones. The rain had started around 2, a light drizzle at first that had gradually intensified into a steady downpour, and the weather forecast was calling for it to continue through the night and into the next day. Bad weather meant fewer people on the streets, which usually meant fewer calls, which meant their evening patrol would likely be quiet. Or so Marcus thought. The call came in at 7:43, just as Marcus was finishing his dinner in the station's break room. A concerned citizen had reported seeing what they described as suspicious activity near the abandoned Holloway house. Kids, probably, the dispatcher had said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had taken hundreds of similar calls, probably just teenagers trying to get in. It happens every few months, Marcus had nodded, even though the dispatcher couldn't see him, already gathering his things and signaling to Rex that their dinner break was over. They had responded to calls about the Holloway house at least half a dozen times in the past 5 years, and every single time it had been exactly what the dispatcher suggested. Bored teenagers looking for a thrill, most of whom scattered like startled birds the moment they saw the police car's lights round the corner. There was no reason to think this call would be any different. And yet, as they drove through the rain-slicked streets toward Maple and 9th, Marcus noticed that Rex was not behaving normally. Usually, during transit to a call, the German Shepherd would sit calmly in the back of the patrol vehicle conserving energy, maintaining that disciplined reserve that made him such an effective partner. But tonight, Rex was pacing. His nails clicked against the floor of the vehicle as he moved from one side to the other, peering out each window in turn. His whines so soft they were almost inaudible beneath the sound of the rain hammering against the roof. "Easy, boy," Marcus said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "It's probably nothing." Rex didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something outside the window, something Marcus couldn't see. and the intensity of his focus sent a small shiver down Marcus's spine despite the patrol car's warm interior. They arrived at the Holloway house at 8:03. The caller had mentioned seeing a light in one of the windows, but as Marcus pulled up to the curb, all he could see was darkness. The house sat on a corner lot, larger than its neighbors, set back from the street behind an overgrown yard that had long since surrendered to weeds and wild growth. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the property, but sections of it had collapsed over the years, leaving gaps large enough for a person to slip through, or a teenager, or a dog. The rain had intensified during their drive, falling now in sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed several seconds later by the low rumble of thunder. It was the kind of night that made people want to stay. Inside, huddled beneath blankets, listening to the storm's fury from a place of warmth and safety. It was not the kind of night anyone should be exploring an abandoned house, unless they had no choice, unless they were hiding from something, unless they had nowhere else to go. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the patrol car, immediately feeling the rain soak through his uniform jacket. He walked around to the back and opened the door for Rex, who leaped out with an eagerness that surprised him. Usually, Rex responded to calls with calm professionalism, treating each situation with the same measured approach that made him so valuable as a police dog. But tonight was different. Tonight, something had awakened in the animal, some ancient instinct that Marcus had never witnessed before. Rex moved directly toward the gap in the fence, his nose working furiously, his tail held high in that alert position that indicated he had detected something significant. Marcus followed, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain like a lighthouse through fog. The beam illuminated the overgrown path that led from the fence to the front porch, revealing years of accumulated debris, fallen branches, plastic bags caught on weeds, the rusted skeleton of what might have once been a bicycle, and footprints, fresh footprints in the mud leading directly toward the house's front door. Marcus's training kicked in immediately. He keyed his radio and reported the situation, his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline that had begun to pulse through his system. Possible unauthorized entry. Evidence of recent foot traffic, requesting backup. The dispatcher acknowledged, informed him that the nearest available unit was approximately 8 minutes out. Standard procedure would have been to wait, to secure the perimeter, to let backup arrive before entering an unsecured structure. But Rex had other plans. The German Shepherd had followed the footprints up to the front porch, and now stood at the door, pawing at the rotted wood, that same strange sound escaping his throat that was neither bark nor growl, but something older, something more urgent. The door was ajar, not by much, just a few inches, but enough to tell Marcus that someone had recently pushed it open. The lock, he could see even from this distance, had been broken long ago, replaced by a length of chain that had been cut with bolt cutters. Recent cut marks gleamed in the beam of his flashlight. "Rex," he called, "heel." Rex ignored him. In 5 years of partnership, through hundreds of calls and dozens of dangerous situations, Rex had never ignored a direct command. He had been trained not to. He had been conditioned through thousands of hours of repetition to respond to Marcus's voice as if it were the voice of God himself. But tonight, the dog stood at that door, refusing to move, refusing to obey, every fiber of his being focused on whatever lay beyond that thin barrier of rotted wood and peeling paint And that's when Marcus knew that this was not a routine call, that this was not teenagers looking for thrills or homeless individuals seeking shelter from the rain. Rex's instincts, those same instincts that had allowed the dog to find drugs hidden in false-bottomed suitcases, to track suspects through miles of wilderness, to detect the presence of explosives from distances that seemed almost supernatural, those instincts were telling him that something in this house needed to be found, needed to be saved, right now. Marcus made a decision that went against his training, against protocol, against every safety procedure he had internalized over 11 years on the force. He pushed open the door and stepped inside the Holloway house, Rex immediately at his side, both of them swallowed by the darkness within. The smell hit him first, that particular odor of abandonment that all empty buildings eventually develop, a mixture of dust and mold and decay that spoke of years without human habitation. But beneath that familiar smell, there was something else, something that made Rex's nose twitch and his ears flatten against his skull, something organic, something alive. The interior of the Holloway house was a time capsule of the life that had once existed within its walls. Furniture still occupied its original positions, though it was covered now in thick layers of dust and the occasional spider web. Family photographs hung on the walls at crooked angles, their frames darkened with age, the faces within them barely visible in the weak beam of Marcus's flashlight. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its pendulum frozen mid-swing, eternally marking a time that no longer existed. The footprints continued across the dust-covered floor, leading from the entrance toward a doorway at the far end of the room. Marcus followed them, his flashlight sweeping methodically from side to side, checking corners and alcoves with the practiced paranoia of a man who had learned never to trust the darkness. Rex moved beside him, no longer racing ahead, but matching his pace exactly, as if they were connected by an invisible leash. Together, they passed through the living room and into what had once been a kitchen. The appliances were ancient relics of a bygone era. A refrigerator with rounded corners and chrome trim. A stove with knobs that no fire had touched in nearly 2 decades. The cabinets hung open, their contents long since removed by one of the many unsuccessful attempts to prepare the house for sale. The footprints led to a door in the corner of the kitchen, a door that Marcus realized, with a growing sense of unease, led downward to the basement. The basement was where old houses kept their secrets. Every cop knew this, every investigator, every detective, anyone who had spent any time at all crawling through the underbelly of human existence knew that basements were where things were hidden, where things were buried, where things were kept, away from the light, away from prying eyes, away from the world above. Rex sat down in front of the basement door and looked up at Marcus with an expression that the officer had never seen before in their 5 years together. It was not the focused determination the dog usually displayed when tracking a suspect. It was not the eager excitement he showed when presented with a training exercise. It was something else entirely. It was almost human. It was imploring. It was desperate. It was a look that said, clear as any spoken words, "Please, we have to go down there. Someone needs us, right now." Marcus reached for the basement door, his hand trembling slightly, despite his best efforts to control it. The metal handle was cold against his palm, slick with the condensation that had formed in the abandoned house's stagnant air. He could hear his own breathing, loud in the silence, competing with the distant sound of rain still hammering against the roof. He could hear Rex's breathing, too, faster than usual, the dog's entire body vibrating with an anticipation that seemed to electrify the very air around them. The door creaked open, revealing wooden stairs that descended into absolute blackness. Marcus's flashlight beam struggled to penetrate the darkness, reaching perhaps halfway down before being swallowed entirely by the void below. The smell was stronger here. That organic scent that Rex had been tracking, combined now with something else, something that Marcus's brain struggled to identify until suddenly, with a jolt of recognition, it clicked into place. The smell of baby powder. And beneath it, unmistakable, the smell of fear. Every muscle in Marcus's body tensed. His free hand moved automatically to his service weapon, though he didn't draw it, not yet. Beside him, Rex had risen from his sitting position and was now straining toward the stairs, his front paws on the top step, that strange sound once again escaping his throat. "Hello," Marcus called down into the darkness. His voice echoed off unseen walls, bouncing back to him distorted and strange. "This is the Cedar Falls Police. If anyone is down there, please identify yourself." Silence. No, not silence. Something else. A sound so faint that Marcus almost convinced himself he was imagining it. A whimper, or a sob, or perhaps the cry of a small child. Rex didn't wait for permission. The training that had governed his behavior for 7 years, the discipline that had made him one of the most decorated police dogs in the department's history, all of it evaporated in an instant. He bounded down the stairs, his nails scrabbling against the wooden steps, and disappeared into the darkness below. "Rex!" Marcus shouted, but the dog was gone, consumed by the basement's hungry void. He had no choice but to follow. The basement stairs were treacherous, each step groaning beneath Marcus's weight as if threatening to give way entirely. He descended as quickly as he dared, one hand gripping the splintered railing, the other sweeping his flashlight back and forth in desperate arcs. The smell of baby powder grew stronger with each step, mixing now with other scents that his racing mind struggled to catalogue. Food, or rather, the absence of it. That hollow, stale smell of hunger that clings to places where sustenance has been rare. And beneath all of that, the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Old blood, dried blood. Blood that had been spilled and left to mark its territory on the concrete floor. Marcus reached the bottom of the stairs and swept his flashlight across the basement. What he saw made him freeze, his breath catching in his throat, his heart seeming to pause mid-beat. The basement had been transformed, not into a storage space or a workshop or any of the mundane purposes that basements typically served. It had been transformed into a prison. A makeshift cell had been constructed in one corner, created from chain-link fencing and wooden pallets, secured with combination locks and zip ties. The floor inside the cell was covered with a thin mattress, stained and worn, surrounded by empty water bottles and the wrappers of convenience store snack foods. A bucket sat in one corner, serving as a toilet. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, though it was dark now, its power cut along with the rest of the house years ago. And there, in the center of that cell, huddled together like survivors of some unspeakable storm, were 2 children. A girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with tangled brown hair and enormous eyes that reflected Marcus's flashlight beam like terrified moons, and a boy, younger, maybe 5 or 6, clutched tightly in her arms, his face buried against her chest, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Rex had already reached the cell. He was sitting directly in front of it, his tail sweeping gently across the concrete floor, His entire demeanor transformed from the urgent intensity of before to something softer, something almost maternal. He was whining softly, a sound of comfort rather than distress, and the little girl was staring at him with an expression of absolute wonder, as if she had never seen a dog before, as if this creature, this furry guardian who had led Marcus to this dark place, was the most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. Now, before we continue, there's something I'd like to ask of you. Whether you're listening to this on your morning commute, watching this before bed, or just taking a break from the chaos of everyday life, I want you to take a moment to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We bring you stories like this every week, stories about the incredible bond between humans and animals, stories about loyalty and sacrifice, and the moments that remind us what it means to be alive. And while you're at it, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from. Are you in California? Texas? Maybe watching all the way from Australia or the United Kingdom? We always love seeing where our community is spread across the globe. Now, back to the story, because what happened next in that basement is something you really need to hear. Marcus approached the cell slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm, his flashlight beam lowered so it wouldn't blind the terrified children within. "Hey there," he said, his voice soft, pitched into that gentle register that he usually reserved for frightened witnesses and traumatized victims. "It's okay. I'm a police officer. I'm here to help you." The girl stared at him with those enormous eyes, her arms tightening protectively around her little brother. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything except hold his gaze with an intensity that made Marcus's heart ache with a physical pain. How long had these children been down here? Days? Weeks? The evidence suggested the latter. The pile of empty wrappers, the state of the mattress, the way the girl's cheekbones jutted beneath skin that had grown too tight. Someone had been keeping them here, feeding them just enough to survive, providing water, maintaining this prison with methodical, cold-blooded calculation. But why? And where was that someone now? Marcus knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the children. Rex remained at his side, that gentle whining continuing, his tail still sweeping the floor in slow, reassuring arcs. The younger child had turned his head slightly, one eye peeking out from behind his sister's protective embrace to stare at the dog with cautious curiosity. "My name is Marcus," the officer said, "and this is Rex. We're going to get you out of here, okay? But I need you to tell me something first. Is there anyone else in this house? Anyone who might hurt you?" The girl's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at her brother, then at Rex, then back at Marcus. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and hoarse from disuse. "Mommy," she said. "Mommy's upstairs." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Mommy! These weren't random victims. These weren't kidnapped strangers. These were children who had been imprisoned by their own mother, locked in a basement while the world above them went on spinning, while schools taught lessons they would never learn, while holidays came and went without celebration, while the ordinary miracle of childhood was systematically stripped away and replaced by this nightmare of concrete walls and chain-link fencing. Marcos's radio crackled to life. His backup had arrived. As he keyed his response, providing a rapid-fire summary of what he'd found, his mind was already racing through the implications. If the mother was still in the house, she was likely hiding. The footprints leading to the basement suggested someone had been here recently, perhaps delivering the latest meager allotment of food and water before retreating back to wherever she spent her days. The Holloway house had been empty for 17 years, but that didn't mean someone couldn't have been living in the peripheral spaces, in the attic perhaps, or in one of the outbuildings on the property. Officers would need to sweep the entire premises. The children would need medical attention immediately. Child Protective Services would need to be contacted. The media would inevitably catch wind of this, and within hours the story would be everywhere. Another chapter in the endless chronicle of human cruelty. But for now, in this moment, Marcus's only concern was getting these children out of their prison. He examined the locks on the cell, quickly determined that he wouldn't be able to break them without tools, and radioed for bolt cutters. While he waited for another officer to bring them down, he sat on the cold concrete floor just outside the cell, Rex pressed against his side, and talked to the children in a soft, steady voice. He told them about Rex, about how the dog had been the one to find them, about how Rex had somehow known, even from outside the house, that someone needed help. He told them about the rain outside, about how it would soon stop and the sun would come out and the world would look fresh and clean. He told them about the officers waiting upstairs, about the doctors who would make sure they were healthy, about the social workers who would find them a safe place to stay. He told them everything except the one thing that was burning inside him, demanding to be released, the white-hot rage he felt toward whoever had done this, toward the mother who had locked her own children in a basement like animals, who had stripped away their humanity and their hope and left them to rot in the darkness. The bolt cutters arrived. Marcus worked quickly, snapping through the combination locks and pulling apart the chain-link fencing that had served as the children's cage. The girl hesitated when the barrier finally fell, as if she couldn't quite believe that freedom was being offered. It was Rex who finally convinced her. The German shepherd rose from his position beside Marcus and walked slowly, deliberately, into the cell. He approached the children with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible for an animal trained in aggression and apprehension, his head lowered, his tail waving in slow, soothing motions. He lay down beside them, his body forming a protective barrier between the children and the darkness beyond, and rested his head on his paws. The little boy reached out first. His small hand, dirty and trembling, touched Rex's fur with the reverence of someone touching something sacred. And then, for the first time since Marcus had found them, the boy smiled. It was a tiny thing, that smile, a mere ghost of what a child's smile should be, but it was enough. It was proof that somewhere beneath the trauma and the terror, the essential spark of humanity still survived. The girl followed her brother's lead. She released her death grip on the boy and reached out to stroke Rex's ears, her touch tentative at first, then growing more confident. And as she petted the dog, something in her face changed. The fear didn't disappear, couldn't disappear after what she had endured, but it retreated slightly, making room for something else. Hope, perhaps, or at least the memory of what hope used to feel like. Marcus wrapped his uniform jacket around the girl's shoulders and lifted the boy into his arms. Together, with Rex leading the way, they climbed out of that basement, out of the darkness, and into the light of the officers' flashlights that now filled the Holloway house's first floor. In the days that followed, the investigation pieced together the terrible truth of what had happened in that abandoned house. Margaret Sullivan, the children's mother, was found hiding in the attic, her thin frame curled into a corner behind boxes of old clothes and forgotten furniture. She had suffered a mental breakdown 18 months earlier, following the death of her husband in a car accident, and had become convinced that the outside world was dangerous, that unseen forces were conspiring to take her children away from her. In her fractured mind, locking them in the basement was an act of protection. Keeping them hidden from view was the only way to keep them safe. She had continued to provide for them after a fashion, had brought them food and water every few days, had spoken to them through the chain-link fence, had told them stories about the dangerous world outside, had promised that one day when the threat had passed, she would let them out. But the threat, of course, would never pass, because it existed only in her damaged mind. And so the children had remained in that basement, their world shrinking to the dimensions of their cell, their development frozen in place while time continued its relentless march forward. The girl, whose name was Emma, was 8 years old. She had been in the basement for nearly a year, since shortly after her mother's breakdown had fully consumed her grip on reality. She had been enrolled in 2nd grade before her disappearance, a bright student with a gift for reading and a collection of illustrated books about animals that she had loved more than anything. When the teachers and classmates had asked about her, Mrs. Sullivan had claimed she was being homeschooled. No one had thought to question it. No one had thought to check. The boy, named Noah, had been in the basement for his entire conscious memory. He was 6 years old now, but he had been locked away since before his 5th birthday. He had never attended school, never played in a park, never experienced any of the countless ordinary moments that constitute a normal childhood. His entire existence had been defined by the dimensions of that chain-link cell, by the limited stimulation of his sister's whispered stories and the occasional beam of sunlight that found its way through a crack in the basement's foundation. And yet, somehow, they had survived. They had survived because they had each other, because Emma had taken on the role of protector and caregiver to her little brother with the fierce determination of a child forced to grow up far too fast. She had rationed their food when supplies ran low, had told him stories to distract him from the hunger and the fear, had created games they could play in their limited space, had held him when he cried, and promised him that one day someone would come to rescue them. One day someone would find them, and someone had. Rex became a celebrity in the weeks following the rescue. The story of the police dog who refused to obey orders, who demanded that his handler investigate an abandoned house, who led officers to 2 children trapped in a basement, captured the imagination of the entire nation. News crews descended on Cedar Falls, all of them wanting to interview Marcus, all of them wanting footage of the heroic German shepherd who had trusted his instincts over his training. The department received thousands of letters addressed to Rex from children and adults alike, many of them containing treats and toys, many of them simply expressing gratitude for what the dog had done. But it was the letter from Emma that meant the most. A few weeks after she and Noah had been placed with foster parents, after the initial whirlwind of medical examinations and interviews, and the slow, painful process of reintroduction to normal life, Emma wrote a letter to the police department. Her handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven in ways that revealed how little practice she had gotten during her year in captivity. But her words were clear. "Dear Rex," she wrote, "thank you for finding us. When I saw you through the fence, I thought you were an angel. I know you're a dog, and dogs aren't angels, but that's what I thought anyway. You looked at me, and I felt like you could see inside me, like you knew everything I was feeling without me having to say anything. Noah talks about you all the time. He asks if we can visit you. I told him I don't know if that's allowed, but maybe you could ask your human to ask someone. We are with a nice family now. They have a cat named Whiskers, which isn't as good as a dog, but Noah likes him. We have our own beds, and we can go outside whenever we want. It's strange to have so much space. Sometimes I forget, and I wake up thinking I'm still in the basement, but then I see the window and I remember. I am glad you didn't listen when your human told you to leave. I don't know how you knew we were there, but you did. You're a hero. Love, Emma. The letter was framed and hung in the department's K-9 unit, where it remains to this day. But that wasn't the end of the story. Mrs. Sullivan, the children's mother, was arrested and charged with unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, and a host of other crimes. But as the investigation continued, and as mental health experts evaluated her condition, a more complicated picture began to emerge. She was not a monster, not in the traditional sense. She was a woman whose mind had broken under the weight of grief, whose mental illness had manifested in a way that, while deeply damaging to her children, had originated from a distorted desire to protect them. The prosecutor's office, taking into account her psychiatric evaluations and the recommendations of mental health professionals, ultimately decided not to pursue criminal charges. Instead, Mrs. Sullivan was committed to a psychiatric facility where she would receive the treatment she desperately needed. It was not justice in the traditional sense. It was not punishment, but it was, perhaps, something more valuable. It was an acknowledgment that not all wrongdoing stems from malice, that sometimes the line between victim and perpetrator is blurred beyond recognition, that the human mind is capable of creating prisons far more confining than any made of steel and concrete. The decision was controversial. Some felt Mrs. Sullivan should have faced the full weight of the law, should have been made to answer for the suffering she had caused her children. But for Marcus, who had seen the children's faces when they emerged from the basement, who had witnessed firsthand the damage that had been done, the decision felt right. Those children needed healing, not headlines. They needed a path forward, not a courtroom battle that would force them to relive their trauma again and again. They needed, in short, exactly what they were getting: a chance to start over. 6 months after the rescue, Marcus received a phone call from the foster family caring for Emma and Noah. They had a request. Would it be possible, they asked, for the children to visit Rex? Just for an afternoon? Just long enough to say thank you in person. The department agreed. Arrangements were made, and on a sunny Saturday in May, with the rain long forgotten and the world dressed in the full glory of spring, Emma and Noah walked into the K-9 unit's training facility to meet their hero. Marcus had prepared Rex as best he could, though the dog seemed to understand the significance of the occasion without being told. He sat at perfect attention as the children approached, his tail sweeping the ground in slow, measured arcs, his eyes fixed on their faces with an intensity that contained none of the urgency from that night in the Holloway house, only a deep, quiet recognition. Emma fell to her knees in front of Rex and wrapped her arms around his neck. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The dog leaned into her embrace, his head resting against her shoulder, his eyes closing as if in meditation. Noah hung back at first, clinging to his foster mother's hand, watching the reunion with the wary hesitation of a child who had learned not to trust the world. But then Rex turned his head and looked directly at the boy, and something passed between them, some wordless communication that transcended species and circumstance. Noah released his foster mother's hand and walked forward. He reached out and touched Rex's face, his small fingers tracing the contours of the dog's muzzle, exploring the texture of his fur. And then he did something he had never done before, not in the basement, not in the hospital, not in the foster home. He laughed. It was a small sound, hesitant and unfamiliar, as if the boy was trying out a muscle he wasn't sure he still possessed. But it was unmistakably laughter, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside him, breaking through the walls that trauma had erected, announcing to the world that Noah Sullivan was still capable of joy. Marcus watched the scene unfold with tears streaming down his face. He was not a man who cried easily. His profession demanded a certain emotional distance, a protective shell that kept the horrors of the job from seeping into his soul. But in this moment, watching a damaged child laugh while holding onto a dog who had saved his life, Marcus felt that shell crack wide open. Around him, his fellow officers wore similar expressions. Some had pulled out their phones to record the moment. Others simply stood in silence, witnesses to a scene that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The foster mother was openly sobbing, clutching her husband's arm as if she might collapse without the support. And Rex, the hero at the center of it all, simply sat there with his tail wagging, accepting the children's affection as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The visit lasted 3 hours. Emma and Noah explored the canine facility, met some of the other police dogs, watched a few training demonstrations, and asked approximately 10,000 questions about what it was like to be a dog handler. Marcus answered each question with the patience of a saint, though his voice occasionally broke when the children's inquiries touched on topics that reminded him of what they had endured. "Can Rex smell bad dreams?" Noah asked at one point, his small face serious with concern. "Is that how he knew we were scared?" Marcus had no idea how to answer that. He had no scientific explanation for how Rex had known that 2 children were trapped in the basement of a house the dog had never visited before, how the German shepherd had sensed their distress from outside in the rain, how his instincts had overridden years of training and compelled him to disobey direct orders. Some mysteries, Marcus had learned, were not meant to be solved. Some connections between humans and animals, between suffering and salvation, operated on frequencies that logic could not detect. "Maybe," Marcus said finally, kneeling down to meet Noah's eyes, "maybe Rex can smell bad dreams. Or maybe he can smell the good ones, too, the ones you're going to have from now on." Noah considered this possibility with the gravity of a philosopher contemplating the nature of existence. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned his attention to scratching behind Rex's ears. When the visit finally came to an end, when the foster parents had gathered their charges and begun the process of saying goodbye, Emma asked if she could have a moment alone with Rex. The adults exchanged glances, then stepped back, giving the girl and the dog their privacy. No one was close enough to hear what Emma whispered into Rex's ear, but whatever she said, Rex responded by licking her face gently, his tail wagging with quiet enthusiasm. When Emma stood up, her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "Ready?" her foster mother asked, extending a hand. Emma took the hand, then looked back at Rex one last time. "Ready," she said, and as she walked away, Marcus could have sworn he saw Rex nod. In the years that followed, Emma and Noah thrived in their foster home, eventually being adopted by the same family that had taken them in. Both children required extensive therapy to process their trauma, and both faced challenges that their peers could not begin to understand. But they had each other, and, in a way, they had Rex. The police department arranged regular visits, allowing the children to maintain their bond with the dog who had saved them. Emma wrote letters after each visit, chronicling her progress, sharing her achievements, describing the person she was slowly becoming as the shadows of the basement released their grip on her soul. Rex was awarded the Medal of Valor by the department, the highest honor a police dog could receive. Marcus was promoted, though he continued to work with Rex until the German Shepherd finally retired at the age of 9. When Rex passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, Emma, now 14 years old and thriving in her freshman year of high school, delivered a eulogy at the memorial service that left every officer in attendance struggling to maintain their composure. "He didn't just save our lives," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He saved who we could become. When I look at Noah now, when I see him playing with his friends, when I hear him laughing, I remember that none of this would exist if Rex hadn't refused to leave that house. He was stubborn." She smiled at this, and a ripple of soft laughter moved through the crowd. "He was stubborn and disobedient, and did the exact opposite of what he was supposed to do. And because of that, because one dog trusted his heart over his training, 2 kids got to have a future. Thank you, Rex, for everything. You were and always will be the best boy." And so it was, on a rainy November night, in a small town that most people had never heard of, a police dog named Rex made a decision that defied his training and changed the course of multiple lives. He sensed something that no human could detect, pursued it with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and refused to back down until the truth was revealed. What he found in that basement could have broken anyone's spirit, could have served as yet another reminder of the darkness that human beings are capable of inflicting on one another. But instead, it became a story of hope, of resilience, of the extraordinary bond between humans and the animals who share our lives. Some people believe that dogs are simply pets, creatures we care for out of habit or obligation or simple companionship. Some people believe that instinct is merely biology, that the things animals sense are nothing more than chemical reactions translated into behavior. But those people have never witnessed what Marcus witnessed that night. They have never seen a dog look into a child's eyes and communicate something that transcends language. They have never experienced the moment when an animal's loyalty becomes indistinguishable from love. Rex was not just a police dog. He was not just a tool or a partner or a trained asset. He was a guardian, a protector, a keeper of the flame that burns in every living being's heart. He knew, in ways that we may never fully understand, that 2 children were trapped in darkness, and he would not rest until they were brought into the light. That is the power of instinct. That is the depth of the bond between species, and that is why, on nights when the rain falls heavy and the world seems cold and indifferent, we would do well to pay attention to the creatures who share our journey. They may be trying to tell us something important. They may be leading us toward someone who needs our help. They may, in their own silent way, be asking us to be heroes. All we have to do is follow.